1. I remember this event very specifically, despite it having taken place when I was about 8 to 10 years old. My family took a vacation to the Oregon coast almost every year, and seeing as this was 10 years ago, it would have just been me, my parents, and our pug dog. It must have been on the way there when we stopped at an overlook, because the sunset was phenomenal. My parents and our dog got out of the car, but I had a really uneasy feeling and decided to stay. My intuition has always been very strong, so I knew to listen to this kind of feeling. It was a short distance up to the railing that overlooked the water, maybe 20 feet from the car, and my parents were one of 2 couples. The second couple was probably in their late 20s, just like my parents, and they'd been up there when we arrived. Their small red car was already there when we pulled up. If it were a parking lot, the distance between our cars was equivalent to 2 parking spaces. As I waited, I looked around, but since you needed to be standing at the overlook to see anything, I wasn't really entertained. I looked over to the car next to us, and this is where things started to get weird. There was a little boy in the back seat, probably a few years younger than I was. He had short blonde hair and no face. Literally, there was just skin where his facial features should have been. Think Slender Man, but more defined, like a layer of skin had been laid over his whole face, showing the outline of what should be facial features. The skin was smooth and couldn't have been a mask or anything, because it was flush with his hairline and neck. The thing I remember most, though, was how he moved. The closest thing I can get to describe it would be the video of the Kazoo Kid saying, "Wow, the land of make-believe," because of the way he looks all around and the way he moves his head. This went on for the entire time I sat in the car, which couldn't have been more than 5 minutes. The faceless boy just moved his head around, never towards me luckily, because even though he didn't have eyes, I can imagine how chilling his stare would have been. I watched him until my parents got into the car and we drove away. I took one last look at the red car and I could see him inside, still slowly moving his head around. I didn't say anything to my parents for fear of sounding rude. I thought maybe he was just deformed, and I didn't want them to think I was creeped out by some poor little boy with a disability. The more time goes on, the less likely the idea of it just being a deformed kid seems. It wasn't like he'd been burned. The skin looked normal and didn't have any abnormalities. And it's not like he would have had any way to breathe as his mouth and nose were covered in skin. And he didn't have any sort of machinery hooked up to him. I still don't understand what this could have been, aside from an insanely realistic Halloween prop, even though it was mid-August and the thing was moving slowly in the back seat of the car. Nothing scary enough to be a prop, but scary enough to haunt me since I saw it. Any ideas? 2. Something really weird happened to me and my friends last night that I can't explain, and I'm still kind of freaked out about it. Last night, a group of my friends and I decided to go hang out in a friend's backyard. We had a fire pit, a couple grams of weed, some booze, and a ton of snacks. I should point out that although most of my friends were high and or drunk, I wasn't, along with a couple of other people who were designated drivers. Anyway, we stayed out for maybe 3 or 4 hours, until 2 a.m. It was a pretty big backyard and we were pretty far back in it, near some trees and far away from the houses. The fire was getting low and we were out of logs, so we decided to leave. This is when the weird thing happened. We had brought a bunch of stuff out to the backyard, like blankets, people's shoes were everywhere, etc. I was thinking about how difficult it would be to clean up in the dark, so kind of as a joke I snapped my fingers and said, "I'll turn on the light." At that exact moment, the entire area around us lit up like a spotlight. We all just kind of stared at each other for a minute. One of my friends said, "Who did that?" I said, "I think me," and snapped my fingers again, which didn't do anything. I don't think they believed me, but we were all getting creeped out, so we decided to just pack up our stuff and leave. The weird thing I noticed was that while the area around us, pretty much a circle with maybe like a 15-foot diameter, was lit up really bright with kind of a warm yellow glow, the area beyond it was completely pitch black. Like I had been able to make out the trees before, and now I just couldn't. And then, once we started to walk away from the circle of light, some people said that it turned off and went back to normal. But for me and a couple other people, we still could see the glowing circle and everything else was still pitch black. I had to grab somebody's arm to know where I was going, and I honest to God thought I was going blind for a minute. As we walked out of the backyard, my vision kind of faded back in, and I could see enough to drive back home. I was driving a couple friends home, but they didn't say anything about the light, and I didn't bring it up because I didn't want to deal with a bunch of freaked out high people. So this morning I asked my friends what they thought about the light, and most of them said that either they didn't remember it, that it had been something normal and we had just exaggerated it, or that it was something weird that happened because we were high. But I wasn't high, and I remember it completely. So my question is, what did happen? Who turned on the light? 3. This happened almost a decade ago, if not more. It was summertime. I was about 20 or 21, and my best friend, we'll call Mark, and I went to the local swim club to smoke some pot. It was about 10 p.m. I grew up in the neighborhood this pool was connected to. I know the woods that surrounded this pool inside and out. I know the neighborhoods inside out. Either way, it was summer, and my friend and I wanted to smoke some pot somewhere other than home. So we figured we'd go and sit on the outdoor snack bar and watch fireflies. We drove to the pool. We hit the bowl once each, so not stoned at all yet, before Mark said quietly, "Yearly B, there is a man walking right towards us." Quickly we put the bowl out of sight, and just continued to sit while the man wandered up to us. He had curly, shoulder-length brown hair, and was holding a rather large mug in one hand. "Hi," said the stranger. "Hello," we said back. "Nice night to hang out, huh?" said the stranger. "Yeah, I guess," Mark said. "Are you guys smoking pot?" "No," we both said quickly. "Do you guys own this place?" the stranger asked. "No, we're just college students," I said. Not rudely, but not friendly either. "I go to XX school," Mark said. I had my back semi-turned to the stranger at this point, and so I figured I'd contribute to the conversation by saying, "I go to XXX school." At this point I think he misheard me, but I didn't realize it until later because the stranger said, "Oh, my dad went there." "That's impossible, it's an all-girl college," I said in a rather rude tone. "Way to be friendly. Have a good night, guys," the stranger said and started walking back towards the road that led away from the pool. The second he started walking away, this wave of guilt crashed over both my friend Mark and I. We both felt it because when we got into the car, Mark mentioned feeling extreme guilt, for really no reason. It felt heavy, thick. I can't explain it. I told Mark, if we see him on the road, let's just apologize. Sure enough, we drive about 25 feet from the entrance of the parking lot, and there is a stranger walking down the road. We pull up next to him, and I roll down my window. "Hey, we're sorry. We were smoking pot and you scared us and made us nervous," I said. "That's okay, guys, I understand. Have a nice night." And he smiled at us. We said goodnight and drove off. The second we drove off, the guilt lifted. As I said earlier, I know these woods and roads like the back of my hand. We pulled out onto the main road and drive past the local neighborhood church, and the stranger is in the church parking lot, mug in hand, walking. Mark grabbed my arm and pointed him out. It was physically impossible that this man made it from where we said goodnight to the church parking lot, on foot, in the space of the 3 to 4 minutes it took us to drive it. I have walked the same distance myself many times, and it takes at least 10 minutes. If he had run past us, we would have seen him. There are no shortcuts through the woods to the neighborhoods that even at a dead sprint, that would have gotten him here that fast. My friend Mark and I have talked about this incident many times since then, and the only conclusion we've ever been able to come up with is that he was some sort of angel sent to scare us away from the pool, either because police were coming or perhaps something worse. I say angel because of the guilt we felt, and the fact that we saw him in the church parking lot. What are your thoughts? 4. I was playing with my brother in the family's garage. I owned a super bouncy Pokemon ball. There was a small Pokemon inside, and it was really adorable. It was small enough that you could hold it in your hand. We played a game where my brother would throw the ball, it would bounce off the wall and I would catch it. Then I would do the same thing and my brother would catch it. We had done this for some time when it was my brother's turn to throw. He threw the ball, and I could recall seeing it fly through the air. Then it was simply nowhere. Now I don't see it clearly disappear mid-air, but you would assume it would bounce off from the wall in front of us and back towards us. There was a good distance between the wall and us, so it was fairly easy to follow the ball's movement and catch it. But suddenly the ball was simply nowhere to be found. We searched the garage for 10 minutes, and I became anxious since I had become really attached to this ball and the cute Pokemon inside it. When my brother called quit to our search, I became depressed and later in the evening even cried a little about the ball. I thought of it being somewhere all alone, sad that we couldn't find it. This thought, of course, made me even more miserable. My parents didn't really react to it in any way. It was just a bouncy ball and sometimes toys get lost. Such is life. But me, I just hoped from the depths of my heart that I could get the ball back. The next morning I was readying to go outside. As I opened the door, the ball, it was right there in the middle of our front porch, far away from the garage. I took the ball and rushed back inside, happily cheering, "You found it! Where did you find the ball?" My parents were dumbfounded. They hadn't gone looking for it. They looked at my brother, who said he hadn't gone outside during the whole morning. They were all confused, but I was just cheering. In a way, I believed them. My parents wouldn't put a ball right in front of the door. It was translucent and you could unknowingly step on it, trip and hurt yourself. Besides, I'm sure they didn't have time to go look for a single toy ball. My strongest suspicion was that either my brother had gone back to the garage and eventually found the ball, deciding to leave it on the porch for me to find, or he had pretended to throw the ball back in the garage, but instead of throwing it, he had put it in his pocket. He had always been sort of a prankster, and when he saw how sad I was becoming of losing it, he decided to return it, leaving it on the porch. But doing a prank that lasted for the rest of the evening and seeing me being miserable deep into the night, that's not my brother. Nor would it have been my brother to simply leave it on the porch. I'm sure he would have come to my room announcing, "Look what I have here. Now who do you want to thank?" He wants to feel important like that. Of course, there's also the chance that my father had visited the garage and found it. But he would have just brought it inside and told me he had found it. So in a way, the case never got solved. The object simply disappeared, then reappeared later. Back then, my grandmother had passed away only a year ago, and I remember having thought that the ghost of my grandma had found it and returned the ball to me. It was a beautiful thought. 5. Back when I was in year 8 at school in the UK, we had compulsory technology and design class. The project we were assigned was to make a pencil holder out of acrylic for someone. I decided to make one for my mum, which was going to be my best attempt at a movie reel with holes in, and decorative bits of smaller acrylic glued around it. Well, these smaller bits were going to need shaped using a band facer, a large vertical band sander, which material had to be pushed into manually by resting it on a platform. So there I was with my goggles on, sanding my 4th or 5th piece, which measured around 5 centimeters squared in area. I was sanding like I was taught to, 2 hands firmly on the acrylic, pressing it both lightly into the platform and lightly into the rotating sander. That's when things got weird. As the acrylic was being sanded, it just vanished, right in front of me. My 2 hands were no longer touching it, but pressing down on the empty platform, and the acrylic was nowhere to be seen. I had just witnessed it completely stop existing without taking my eye off of it. However, my first thoughts were pretty rational, that it had been thrown from the machine. However, this didn't make much sense as it was particularly flat and secured between the machine and my grip. Also, the band was sanding downwards into the machine's vacuum, so it couldn't have provided such force to send it in any other direction. In spite of my disbelief, I told my teacher, and he seemed as baffled as me. We got the class to search the room. Now this workshop is pretty well laid out, with each machine in its own space spread out against the four walls, with benches in the center of the room. We found nothing. I checked under the machine, behind the machine, under the tables, and other shelves and cupboards. Nothing. I then wondered whether it had been sanded super quickly and had gone into the machine. But there was just too much of it for that to have happened in a split second. My teacher said he had never heard of anything like this happening on that machine before. The gap between the platform and the sander was also very thin, about 3 millimeters. When the machine was switched off, I tried to fit a finished acrylic piece into the slot, but it was too thick. The teacher opened up the machine anyway, and I got to see what had been vacuumed away. Again, no trace of anything other than wood and acrylic filings. I remember being pretty annoyed at the time, since these things took about a week to be cut from big sheets. A 12-year-old's tech project was the technician's lowest priority, and I had to start all over again. All my classmates thought it was wild, and we used to talk about it pretty frequently. I look back on it now with even more disbelief. Having read so many of these stories, I'm inclined to think it just ceased to exist in this universe. I guess I'm lucky to have witnessed something like that. If anyone is willing to provide another explanation, I would be keen to hear it. Also, let me know if you've witnessed something similar. 6. The first incident happened when I was about 8 or 9 years old. My father was always a very intuitive person, sometimes eerily so. He had almost died as an infant if not for an emergency surgery. He enjoyed going to our local horse racing track, was known for his luck. The live racing ends in the summer because in the desert southwest US, it's too hot for racing there. They have higher stakes, higher prizes at the end of the season. My father had a dream. He was at the track and could see the final scoreboard lit up with the final race results. Very vivid, knew it was foreknowledge. He went to the track, bet on the winning horses, sure enough. There was the scoreboard exactly as his dream. The jackpot was $100,000 US. He received only $50,000 as one other man had bet the same. The second tale happened when my brother and I were in high school. My brother's friend was working crazy hours after school, trying his best to help his family while the father was being treated for cancer. The friend had such a cute younger brother. My father felt for the family as Christmas was approaching, so he made a deal with God. If he could get the winning numbers, he would give the struggling family $1,000 as a Christmas present. Well, yes. The money was won. The prize was just above the $1,000 he had prayed for. Wrote a check out just before Christmas. It was probably one of the best gifts given to both my father and the family. Hey everybody, Hellfreezer here, and thank you very much for listening to Glitch in the Matrix Stories. I guess we'll see how many stories it's going to be when it goes up, because we're running a bit short this week, and you know what I'm like with my 20-minute videos. At least 20 minutes. I was thinking of story number 5 there, about the, well, we'd have called it tech class. I guess that'd be the equivalent. And that was one of my favourite classes in high school. And I liked most of the teachers, but there was one who could never remember my name. My name's John. He'd always call me James. It got to the point where when he ever he'd shout on me to get my attention for something, I'd just ignore him, not to be shitty. I just ignore it. It'd basically be James, James, James. Then he'd eventually click, John. Yes, sir. Oh, yes, how are you doing? Yes, lovely. I think the problem was from what he said, he knew someone with the same last name as me. It was a friend of his, and who was called James. But it was still darn annoying. And I don't think he ever actually stopped, but he did get a little better at it. And the ironic thing is, I couldn't even tell you his name now if I tried. Mr. Something. I think he occasionally wore a blue shirt, had dark hair. I do remember one other thing. I don't know what brought this up, but he did explain to the class that when you're trying to explain the meaning of something, a word, don't use the word you're trying to explain in your explanation, which sounds kind of obvious, but I guess for some people it's hard to do. Especially to a bunch of kids, it would be, But you're at school to learn, so there we go. Okay, with that, I think I'm going to head off for now. So until next time, thank you very much for listening, and take very good care of yourselves.